The following was written in the World's News on August 6, 1927. Quote, "Suddenly, without a soul on board hearing the warning sound of breakers ahead or the awful reverberations of rollers on the lee shore, the ship struck. Not a dead blow forward against the treacherous rocks, but with a grating crash along her iron hull, causing the ship to quiver from stem to stern, and on a sunken reef that sloped towards the sea, having its broken crest just level with the surface of the water."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, 7 Long Days on the Admella?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Admella was a relatively new ship in 1859. She had been built in Glasgow on 1857 and placed to work along the coast of Australia in 1858 as an intercolonial trader. The 360-ton register ship was an iron-hulled steamer, considered very comfortable and fast by the passengers who took her, and a reliable ship for cargo carrying. Captain McEwen, who had command of the Admella, was also considered a good and experienced officer, with a career of over 30 years, making the Admella a popular choice for people traveling between Adelaide and Melbourne, which was her regular route. On Friday, the 9th of August, 1859, the Admella departed from Adelaide at 5:30 in the morning. On board were 82 passengers and crew of 31, including McEwen, 7 horses, and a cargo that included 93 tons of copper ingots. 4 of the horses were racehorses, heading for the intercolonial champion race that was to be hosted in Melbourne in less than a month. 3 of the racehorses were owned by a man named Hertel Fisher, who was on board as one of the passengers, along with one of his brothers named George Fisher. The Fisher brothers were sons of the president of the South Australian Legislative Council. The weather was good, and even though the ship made one more stop to pick up additional passengers and one last member of the engine crew, bringing the total number of people on board to 113, it seemed as though the ship was going to arrive in Melbourne on schedule. Unfortunately for those on board, the calm on the ship only lasted so long as they were in the St. Vincent Gulf. As the ship left the Gulf, she was met with a heavy swell that increased the further they traveled. While this was reportedly uncomfortable for the passengers, it was even more uncomfortable for the horses, with the racehorses being particularly high-strung. Everyone had sat down for dinner when it was reported that one of the horses belonging to Hertel Fisher, a horse named Jupiter, had gotten stuck on his back in his box due to the heavy rocking of the ship. Captain McEwen and a passenger named Rockfort immediately went to the aid of the frightened horse. And in order to make it easier for everyone involved, Captain McEwen gave the order for the ship's head to be turned into the swell to steady the ship. It would later be noted that during the time that the ship's course was adjusted, the ship was still at full steam, but no one could be certain if she had been pushed back by the swell or by how much the swell had impacted her momentum. Captain McEwen would later estimate that during the hour it took to settle the horse properly, they had traveled 5 miles off course to the southwest, while Rochfort estimated it to have been 2 miles. There was no real way of telling with no land visible, and Captain McEwen gave the order for them to return to their original course, while making no effort to remedy the few miles they had traveled in the wrong direction. At the time, everyone thought it was a harmless deviation, since they were far enough from land. By midnight, all of the passengers had gone to bed, and lightning had started to flash across the sky. Still, there was no problem with the sailing of the ship, and the course was altered to the southeast according to the calculations they could make for their position based on speed and compass. At 4 in the morning, the first mate, who was the officer on watch, ordered the course adjusted again, this time southeast by east. Based on their calculations, dawn should put them in sight of the Cape Northumberland lighthouse. The problem was that all of these calculations were made without knowing exactly how far off course they had gone while tending to the horse the day before. It was still before dawn, with both the captain and the first mate waiting to hear the report that the lighthouse had been spotted, when the Admella struck broadside onto the reef while traveling at full speed. It was later said that if she had traveled just a point more to the south, she would have been safe. But, unfortunately, with the incomplete information that they had of the ship's position, no one had been aware of the need. Many things would later be blamed. The cargo of copper had impacted the compass, or the electrically charged sky as a result of the lightning had impacted the compass, were both theories that were put forward. But most people pointed to the hour spent heading into the swell as the root of the problem. Captain McEwen, in particular, protested that he had carried much larger cargoes of copper without any problems. Having struck the reef broadside at such speed, the ship was driven to the top of the reef, which barely showed over the waves. The ship listed to port, bringing her starboard side high out of the water. It was still pitch dark, meaning that it was hard for anyone on board the Admella to realize what had happened immediately. To make matters worse, the Admella was also now broadside to the swell, and the waves now broke over the ship entirely, sweeping the deck. Whenever this happened, the ship would thump on the rocks, making the entire ship shudder, and making it clear that soon it would break up. It took very little time for the rocks of the reef to drive through the iron plates of the hull. For the first few minutes after they were driven onto the reef, Captain McEwen and his crew desperately tried to save the ship before realizing that it was impossible, and they were trapped. With that realization, Captain McEwen gave the order that the steam valves be opened to release pressure, and ensure that the boilers would not explode. In the meantime, the passengers who had been asleep all rushed to the deck, still in their night clothing, and filled the pre-dawn darkness with their panicked shouts. The Admella had 3 boats. One of them was crushed by the ship's funnel falling, one of the first parts of the ship to go as the ship was pounding on the rocks. The other 2 boats were soon reached by the passengers who, without the captain's directions, or the crew's assistance, took it upon themselves to try to launch the only means they saw of escaping the ship. The panicked passengers were not able to successfully complete this task, however. The ship's quarterboat was soon adrift, with no one in it, and the starboard boat was smashed to pieces by the waves. Within 10 minutes of having hit the rocks, the Admella had lost all 3 of her boats, and the vessel was leaning further and further to port. The ship was also under a considerable amount of strain, as the water under each section of the ship was not equal, nor was the support of the reef. Only a quarter of an hour after the ship had initially struck the reef, the ship suddenly split into 3 pieces, breaking along the bulkheads that divided the hull. With the ship breaking into pieces, many people were thrown into the surging sea and were not seen again. Among them was George Fisher. The middle part of the ship, which carried all of the heavy machinery of the ship, sank below water level, with the exception of the boiler which broke away and stood on top of the reef. There was now a wide chasm between the bow and the stern of the ship, which could not be passed, with surging waves traveling in between the two. Here, the distribution of copper ingots, which were part of the cargo of the Admella, came into play. The stern compartment of the Admella had a load of 63 tons of copper, and was firmly anchored into place on the rocks. The bow of the Admella had 27 tons of copper, and with its lighter load, the sea was able to change the position of the bow on the reef, allowing the waves to sweep across it with more brutality than the people at the stern of the ship were exposed to. Unfortunately, the bow was where almost all of the women and children on the ship had been sheltering when the ship had broken apart. Only 3 women were on the stern part of the ship. Everyone on the bow was now forced to cling desperately to the foremast of the ship so that they would not be swept away. On the stern of the ship, Captain McEwen and his crew tried to find anything that they could use to attract attention in the dark. The ship's lanterns were gone with the waves. The furnaces, which had been glowing hot even as they sank, had long since hissed into silence under the sea, and the rockets that they found in Captain McEwen's cabin were too wet to be of any use. They were forced to wait for 2.5 hours until around 6:30 when dawn finally broke and they were able to take stock of where they were and their situation. What they found was not promising. They were surrounded by angry waves pounding on the rocks that seemed likely to smash anything that ventured into them. And though they could see land 1.5 miles away, they could not see the sign of any town or settlement that might see them and come to their aid. The people on the Admella had a brief moment of hope at 8 in the morning when they spotted the Havila, the Admella's sister ship, pass close to them. However, in spite of hoisting everything from nightclothes to the Union Jack as signals on the stern, and the people on the bow ringing the ship's bell as hard as they could, the Havila passed by without seeing them. The people on board supposed that they had been obscured from view by the large waves that still swept over them, and the pounding surf had drowned out the bell. A new disaster would soon come to pass. The waves continued to hit the bow of the ships particularly hard, shattering the foremast that everyone was clinging to, until, finally, it could no longer withstand the force of the waves and the weight of the people combined. It tipped over into the angry sea, with all of the people still clinging to it. A few people managed to return to the wreck, but many did not. A couple of the men were seen trying to reach the shore by clinging to fragments of wood and wreckage. The people on both pieces of the wreckage watched them with anxiety, hoping that they would reach the shore to get help. But instead, they watched as they were both swept out to the open sea. The next attempt to reach the shore was formed when they saw the ship's boat that had been let drift away in the immediate panic after the wreck was still close by, floating upside down, but seemingly intact. A sailor named Soren Holm volunteered to go swim to it with a rope tied around him and bring it back to the ship. Holm was a good swimmer, but the people on the ship quickly realized that the rope that he had tied around himself was not long enough, and they tied an additional length onto the end so that he would be able to reach the boat. Holm reached the boat and gave the signal, but when they pulled on the rope, the knot that had been tied in it parted. Holm still did not give up, and tried to reach the wreck by swimming and paddling the boat with a plank, but he was eventually washed out to sea just as the previous men. For almost the entire day, the people on the ship could see him in the boat adrift, until a wave upset the boat again, and he was lost. With this occurrence, there were even fewer people who thought it was possible to reach the shore, in spite of a few of the wealthy passengers offering large rewards to anyone who managed it. The second mate eventually felt compelled, possibly out of a sense of duty, to attempt what others had failed. He tied a lifebuoy under his arms and charged into the sea where the surf was weakest, but the waves soon carried him from their view, with the waves crashing over his head with enough force that no one held out any hope for him. With this, thoughts of reaching the land were abandoned. The main concern on the wreck now became food, water, and shelter. There was no drinking water on either part of the ship. Though there were some spirits, it soon became a concern that people were overindulging, and it was causing more chaos as people acted in ways that put them in danger, A ham was found, but the people on the wreck were reluctant to eat it because of how salty and therefore thirst-inducing it was. A bag of almonds and some dried fruit were a more welcome discovery. As for shelter, all that could be provided was some clothing and blankets that had been stored in Captain McEwen's cabin to guard them against the bitter cold that came at night. During the first whole night on the wreck, the people thought that help had come in the form of another ship, the P&O steamer the Bombay, which had a close call with the reef and almost joined them on the rocks. The Bombay continued her voyage, however, and with no means to signal her in the darkness, the Bombay had no way of knowing that they had passed a wreck in the night. On Sunday morning, the people on the bow of the ship, led by an older master mariner named Captain Harris, came to the decision that they had to reach the safer stern of the ship. Calling for a rope to be passed across, they successfully made it so that 15 of the men who had been left on the bow of the ship were able to travel to the stern, though several more did not survive the trip through the waves that swept between the two sections of the ship. The women and children and a few of the men remained on the bow still, and soon after the rope parted and the two sections were separated again. The public would later have some very critical things to say about the men who passed from bow to stern, but left behind women and children to fend for themselves in spite of the lack of supplies or shelter on the bow of the ship. The only man who did attempt the passage with his child tied to his back failed, and both of them were lost. Captain Harris proved to be an asset for the survivors once he did reach the stern. On learning that in part of a cabin that was underwater, there was food in some lockers, he led the first and second engineers into a mission to dive for them until they had brought up 10 pounds of beef and mutton, 20 pounds of cheese, and 6 bottles of preserved fruit, and 5 bottles of desiccated milk. He also brought up some porter and brandy. One sailor drained an entire bottle of porter, but the rest of the crew and passengers treated the brandy with suspicion, fearing the impact it might have on the public order. It was therefore decided to throw most of it into the sea, only preserving a little to add to the desiccated milk. Having passed another day under the hot sun, and with a long, cold night ahead of them, the wealthy passengers once again offered large sums of money to anyone who could reach the shore. 2 experienced sailors, John Leach and Robert Knapman, agreed to make the attempt on a raft that the crew managed to fashion with the only tool available to them, a meat chopper. The 2 sailors were told that if they did reach the shore, they should travel the 20 miles or so that it was estimated lay between the Admella and the McDonnell Light, and get help. By now, the people on the Admella had realized they were wrecked on Carpenter's rocks. Leach and Knappan had a bitter fight against the waves, which had doomed all other attempts to reach the shore. They were finally forced to abandon the raft close to shore, and instead dive below the waves and dig their hands into the sand when the waves washed out, and then allow the waves heading to the shore to carry them forward. It was only by repeating this many times that they reached the safety of shore. The 2 men reached the shore near dusk, and their first thought was water, which they found soon in the form of a marsh. Once they had drunk from that, they turned their steps toward the lighthouse. The 2 sailors traveled all night, and around 7 in the morning on Monday, they knocked on the door of the lighthouse and reported to the surprised lighthouse keeper about the wreck of the Admella. The lighthouse was remote, however, and though the lighthouse keeper immediately saddled his horse and rode for Mount Gambier, where there was a telegraph, he would not arrive until 3 in the afternoon. In spite of the sailors leaving over 50 people still clinging to the wreckage of the Admella when they had gotten onto the raft, the initial telegraph message that went out across Australia was that only 12 people had been left, and the 2 sailors who had reached the lighthouse were feared to be the only survivors. Even with the news getting out about the wreck, reaching her had challenges. The closest help should have been the lighthouse boat, but it was small and judged not even to be suitable for sea travel. 2 fishermen from Port Robe traveled 70 miles on hearing the news to try to help, but seeing the strong breakers around the ship, were forced to give up. Several cities started funds for the purpose of hiring rescue steamers. All along the coastline, people living even remotely in the area of the wreck who had the means to do so rushed to the beach closest to the wreck in the hopes of offering some sort of assistance. From the shore, they could see desperate people still clinging to the wreckage, out of their reach since none of them had a boat. With them, they brought anything they thought might be of use, including carts and horses. Some of the people who rushed to the beach had the luck of finding the Admella's boat, which had been lost, with Soren Holm, resting upside down on the beach. It was very damaged, and they were forced to drag the heavy boat 4 miles to the place closest to the wreck, and then got to work repairing it. Near the boat, they found the remains of the second mate with a lifebuoy still fastened to him. The first attempt to reach the Admella was therefore on Tuesday evening in the Admella's own hastily repaired boat, which was swiftly swamped, and the attempt was given up. The second attempt to reach the Admella was by the steamship Corio, which arrived on Wednesday evening in the middle of a gale, too late to make an attempt until daybreak on Thursday. The Corio was a second choice. It would have been preferred if the Havila, which was a more powerful ship, had been available, but right after the voyage where she had passed the Admella in the dark, the Havila had gone in for repair and, at the time, had no machinery. The Corio turned out not to be up to the task of getting close to the Admella, and a few members of her crew reluctantly agreed to risk the voyage in one of the ship's boats, but after they were driven back twice, they gave up. Meanwhile, the Lady Bird, another steamer, was also in search of the wreck only to miss it entirely and meet with a wave that smashed many of the supplies she carried on board. On board the Admella, the cabin walls had begun to give way under the pounding waves, and under the advice of Captain McEwen, most of the people able to move in spite of the hunger, thirst, and exposure that they had all experienced, moved to the deck. Captain McEwen was proven correct in his warning, and soon the walls of the cabin gave way. Among those who were trapped in the cabin and lost was Captain Harris, who had worn himself out with his many dives for provisions. Now came a more miserable wait than before, one without shelter. The rigging was now the safest place, but that was taken up by the sailors and the passengers, mostly sheltered in the stairway that led down to the submerged areas of the ship. Slowly, the number of survivors diminished because of hunger, thirst, the waves, and the cold. Despair was also beginning to set in more than ever due to watching various rescue attempts fail. Captain Gregg, meanwhile, of the Lady Bird, once again set out to make a rescue. This time, he had on board his ship the harbormaster of Portland, Captain Fothrop, and his crew of volunteer lifesavers, along with their lifeboat. The Lady Bird also finally got solid directions as to where the Admella had wrecked. They came across the 2 fishermen who had made the first rescue attempt, who gave them an exact location to head towards. On reaching the wreck on Friday night around 9 p.m., Captain Fothrop and his men immediately went to try to rescue the people of the Admella. It ended in near disaster. They got near the wreck, but their lines got fouled, and the sea was too rough. They were beaten back, having lost most of their pulling oars, their steering oars, and their rudder. Some of the men were also injured. The men were beaten back to the Lady Bird. The disappointment on the Admella and from the people watching on shore was palpable, but the men under Captain Fothrop promised they would make another attempt soon. The people on shore had not been idle, and on Saturday the 13th, the first rescue attempt of the day came in the form of the Admella's own boat, which had been better repaired. It and a pilot boat left the shore at dawn and succeeded in reaching the side of the Admella. 4 people were lowered from the deck by a rope by Captain McEwen, who had it tied around himself to secure it. Both boats were upset by the surf on their return to shore, but the people on the shore rushed out to help. The 3 people on the Admella's boat were saved, but the accident proved to be too much for the passenger who had been carried on the pilot boat. Soon after this, the lifeboat from the Lady Bird also arrived alongside the Admella and removed the remaining 19 survivors. One of the lifeboat crew members took a particular risk of climbing onto the wreck so that he could carry the one remaining woman on board, a passenger named Miss Ledwith, to safety. Out of the 113 people who had been on board the ship, only 24 had survived, including the 2 men from the raft. 22 men, 1 woman, and 1 boy. They were in terrible condition, offering all of their earthly goods to anyone who could give them water. Wild-eyed and emaciated, but all of them would make full recoveries under the careful care of the people of Portland. The argument over blame as well as merits would continue for long after. Some people thought that the crew of the Lady Bird was praised too much, and that the crew of the lifeboat under the command of Captain Thothrop was overlooked too much. Initially, it was rumored that the 2 sailors who had taken the raft, rather than risking their lives to spread the word of the wreck, had cowardly abandoned the rest of the people on the wreck to their fates, something that all of the survivors vigorously protested. Eventually, medals were awarded to many of the men who had taken part in the rescue, including both of the sailors who had manned the raft, out of recognition that, rather than cowardice, they had taken on a task that few would have been willing to undertake. Captain McEwen and his crew would be completely exonerated from any blame for the loss of the ship. It was felt that they had navigated to the best of their knowledge and experience, and that they had behaved nobly after the wreck. As a final postscript, 3 of the horses managed to free themselves and safely arrive on shore. One of them was the Barber, one of the Hurtle Fisher's racehorses. Fisher could not even begin to speculate on how his horse had managed to escape from its box and reach the shore, but he did later run it in the Flying Bucks Champion race.
For more information, please see Narrative of the Shipwreck of the Admella by Samuel Mossman, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives.